On the 7th of June 1774, on the morning of her 17th birthday, a Spencer girl walked into Wimbledon Parish Church and walked out the wealthiest young woman in England. By nightfall, she had a new name, a new house, and a new husband she barely knew. Within 12 months, she was the most famous woman in London. Within 12 years, she owed £100,000 she could not say out loud, lived in a marriage with 2 other people, and was carrying the child of a man who was not her husband. Her name was Georgiana, and the world has somehow forgotten her. If you stay with this story to the end, I think she will surprise you. Subscribe so you do not miss the women the history books quietly stopped writing about. Chapter 1. The Bride Who Did Not Know What She Was Worth. She turned 17 on her wedding morning, and by nightfall the richest aristocratic estate in England was hers to walk through. The bride was Georgiana Spencer. The morning was the 7th of June 1774. The church was a small parish church in Wimbledon. The groom was William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire, a man of 26 years who had been called for half a decade the most eligible bachelor in Europe. They were marrying at Wimbledon because the bride's mother, Lady Spencer, did not want a public spectacle. The London newspapers had been reporting the engagement for months. The crowds were expected. The Spencers wanted privacy. They got it. The ceremony was small. The signatures were brief. And then the carriage doors closed, and a girl who had been Lady Georgiana Spencer at breakfast became the Duchess of Devonshire by lunch. She had not chosen him. Her mother had. Margaret Georgiana Poyntz, Countess Spencer, was the planning intelligence of the family. She had been raising her eldest daughter for this exact match since the child was 8 years old. The negotiations had taken nearly 2 years. The settlement was enormous. The bride brought a dowry of £20,000 in cash and the social weight of one of the oldest Whig families in England. The groom brought a dukedom, 8 country houses, 200,000 acres, and an annual rent roll that even his lawyers could not put a final figure on. The girl who climbed into the carriage that afternoon was tall, strawberry blonde, and beautiful in a strange asymmetrical way that did not photograph easily, but worked at close range. Her eyes were her best feature. Her cheekbones were high. Her shoulders were already trained for ballrooms. She had been educated in French, Italian, music, drawing, and the careful management of conversation with men older and colder than herself. She had not been educated in money, in marriage, or in any practical knowledge of what it would mean to wake up in the morning at Chatsworth. Chatsworth itself had been waiting for her. The carriage took 2 days from London to reach Derbyshire. They came up through the wooded valleys of the Derwent and over a ridge, and there at the bottom of the long sweep of parkland was the great golden house. Lancelot Capability Brown had redesigned the park 20 years earlier under the 4th Duke. He had moved the river. He had pulled down a section of the village of Edensaw because it had spoiled the view. He had planted trees so that the visitor coming over the ridge would see only the house, the water, and the hills behind. It was a stage set. It had been a stage set for 30 years, and now it had its leading actress. She climbed out of the carriage in the gravel forecourt. The front doors of the painted hall were open. The servants were lined up in 2 rows. The house steward and the housekeeper stood at the head of the lines. Behind them, in strict order, stood the butler, the under-butler, the groom of the chambers, the footmen in their dark blue livery, the ladies' maids, the housemaids, the kitchen maids. Outside, in their own ranks, stood the head gardener and his men, the stud groom and his stable boys. The total number of people watching her walk through the door that afternoon was somewhere in the order of 120. Beside her, walking through the same door, was a man she had spoken to perhaps 20 times in her life. The fifth Duke was 9 years her senior. He was tall, fair, and quiet to the point of strangeness. His conversation, when he had any, was about dogs and cards. His face did not change easily. His friends called him reserved. His enemies, of which he had few, called him cold. He had been brought up to inherit one of the great Whig fortunes, and he had been brought up to feel about it nothing in particular. He did not take her hand at the door. He did not turn to look at her. He walked through the painted hall ahead of her, paused while a footman took his coat, and gave his housekeeper an order about supper. Then he went upstairs. Georgiana stood in the centre of the painted hall, in the middle of the floor that Louis Laguerre had decorated almost a century before with scenes from the life of Julius Caesar, and she understood for the first time that she was alone. She wrote to her mother that night. The letter survives. She said the house was beautiful. She said she was happy. She said her new husband was kind. The handwriting is steady. The words are correct. There is something in the spacing of the sentences that suggests she was crying when she wrote them, and she would do everything in her power for the rest of her life to make sure no one ever knew. Chapter 2. The House That Was Not a Home. Chatsworth had been waiting 120 years for a duchess who could fill it, and now it had one who could not breathe in it. The numbers tell part of the story. The Cavendish Empire in 1774 consisted of 8 major houses. Chatsworth in Derbyshire was the seat. Devonshire House in Piccadilly was the London base. Chiswick House on the western edge of London was the summer villa. Hardwicke Hall, also in Derbyshire, was the older Elizabethan house kept fully staffed for occasional use. Bolton Abbey in Yorkshire was the shooting lodge. Lismore Castle in County Waterford was the Irish seat. Holker Hall in Lancashire and Compton Place in Eastbourne were the secondary residences. Across these properties, the family owned approximately 200,000 acres of agricultural land, coal mines in Derbyshire and Yorkshire, lead mines in the Peak District, and rental rights in central London worth in the order of £10,000 a year on their own. The total annual income, when the books were finally balanced, ran between £60,000 and £80,000. In modern terms, depending on the measure, the family income would have been the equivalent of between £8 and £20 million a year. The staff to run it was on the same scale. At Chatsworth alone, the indoor servants numbered roughly 100 at full strength. The wage bill for indoor staff at Chatsworth, including livery and board, ran to about £3,000 a year. At Devonshire House, the indoor staff numbered between 50 and 60. The chef at Chatsworth was French and was paid 100 guineas a year, the same salary as a minor country vicar. A first footman earned £20 plus livery. A scullery maid earned £6 plus 2 suits of clothes and her board. Outside the houses, the gardeners, gamekeepers, grooms, coachmen, stable boys, and estate labourers numbered several hundred more. There was no part of the year when fewer than 300 people were employed somewhere in the running of the Devonshire estates. Georgiana stood at the top of this empire. She did not know what to do with it. The Duke did not help her. In the first months of the marriage, he spent most of his time in his own apartments, in the library, or at the stables. He took his meals with her in the great dining room because protocol required it. He spoke to her about the weather and the dogs. He did not speak to her about money, about the estate, about politics, or about himself. When he wanted female company, he went to Devonshire House in London, where he kept a long-standing mistress named Charlotte Spencer, a milliner who had borne him a daughter 4 years earlier. That daughter, called Charlotte Williams, lived in the household and was raised partly under Georgiana's eye. The 17-year-old Duchess was expected to know about this and to say nothing about it. She tried. She wrote letters home full of forced cheer. She tried to manage the household. The housekeeper, a woman of great authority who had run Chatsworth for the fourth Duke as well, treated her politely and made all the real decisions herself. The estate steward consulted the Duke and not the new Duchess. The Cavendish chaplain heard her confessions without comment. Her maid dressed her, undressed her, and listened to her cry at night. Within 6 months, Georgiana had begun to do the only thing the house allowed her to do without contradiction. She began to entertain. She held supper parties. She invited her sister Henrietta, called Harriet, who would later marry Lord Duncannon and become her closest companion in the world. She invited the Spencer cousins. She brought up musicians from London. She built friendships with the local Derbyshire gentry. By the spring of 1775, Chatsworth had something it had not had under the cold 5th Duke alone: a permanent low-level hum of social life. The Duke did not seem to notice. He seemed neither pleased nor displeased. Behind the public rooms of Chatsworth lay a service world built specifically not to be seen. The first Duke, when he rebuilt the house from 1687, had paid William Tolman to design a back stair system that allowed footmen to move between floors without crossing the state apartments. The fourth Duke, when he remodelled the approach in the 1760s, had built a service tunnel running under the gravel forecourt so that the kitchen courtyard, the stables and the laundry were invisible from the front. By Georgiana's day, this hidden architecture was complete. A maid could leave her attic bedroom at 5 in the morning, descend by a back stair, cross underground to the kitchen courtyard, fetch coal for the fires, and return to lay them in the state apartments by 7, and never once be seen by a member of the family or a guest. She lived inside this invisible system without ever quite mastering it. Years later, in her letters, she would refer to the housekeeper with respect that bordered on fear. She would speak of the chef as if he were a foreign ambassador. She understood instinctively that the great house was held together by people whose lives she would never share, and whose names she would never fully learn. By the autumn of 1774, the marriage had settled into a pattern that would hold for the rest of the Duke's life. He would be civil. He would be cold. He would expect her to provide a male heir within reasonable time, to maintain the social standing of the family in London, and to give him no public scandal. In return, he would allow her freedom of movement, freedom of friendship, and a household allowance that he assumed was generous. He did not consider the possibility that for a 17-year-old of her temperament, no allowance would ever be generous enough. Chapter 3. The year London looked up. Within 12 months of the wedding, every woman in London was building her hair 3 feet tall to look like Georgiana. It happened almost by accident. In the late summer of 1774, a few weeks after the wedding, a Scottish diplomat called Lord Stormont returned from his post in Paris with a single ostrich feather that he had picked up for one of his sisters. The feather was 4 feet long. The colours were natural ivory and dust grey. Stormont, who had met Georgiana once and been charmed by her, sent the feather to Devonshire House as a curiosity. Georgiana wore it that night to a ball at Almack's. By the end of the evening, every woman in the room had asked her where it came from. Within 2 weeks, the demand for ostrich feathers in London was so great that the supply ran out. Wholesalers sent ships to North Africa. Society women bribed undertakers for the black plumes used on the horses at funerals. A small economy of ostrich smuggling sprang up in Paris and Antwerp. The price of a single good feather rose tenfold inside a single season. London, almost unconsciously, had decided that whatever Georgiana did, the rest of the country would do as well. She was learning, very fast, what this meant. By the spring of 1775, she was wearing what would later be called the pouf, a hairstyle modelled on the Parisian work of Léonard Autier, who was Marie Antoinette's hairdresser. The pouf was built on a frame of wire and horsehair, padded with wool, dressed with powdered hair, and decorated with whatever caught the eye that morning. A pastoral scene of miniature wooden sheep grazing on green silk grass, a nautical scene with model ships tossing on a sea of blue ribbon, a garden scene with real flowers in tiny vases of water. Georgiana once wore a hairstyle that included a model windmill whose sails turned slightly when she walked. The newspapers reported these things as if they were diplomatic events. The fashion was uncomfortable, ridiculous, and dangerous. Women travelling in carriages had to sit on the floor of the coach to fit their hair under the roof. Door frames in older houses had to be raised. A common complaint in society letters of 1776 is that the wearer could not sleep for several nights because the hair could not be taken down. Some women slept sitting upright in chairs, their poufs protected by silk bags, for weeks at a time. Lice and other small infestations were a constant problem. The fashion was hated by clergymen, mocked by satirists, and copied by every woman who could afford it. Georgiana was at the centre of all of it. She was painted by Joshua Reynolds in 1775, by Thomas Gainsborough in 1776, and by Maria Cosway in 1777. Reynolds, the older man, painted her with great compositional restraint in soft greys and whites. Gainsborough, the more daring, painted her in the wide blue plumed hat that would become the most famous image of her ever made. The portrait was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1787 and stopped traffic on the streets outside. A century later, in May of 1876, the painting was stolen from a London dealer the night before it was due to be sold. It would not surface again until 1901, after 25 years lost in the hands of an American criminal called Adam Worth. The first Gainsborough hat that Georgiana wore at a private ball at Devonshire House in 1784 was a personal joke. By the 1790s, it was a national style. While she was learning to be looked at, she was also learning to use Devonshire House. The London house sat behind a high blank brick wall on the south side of Piccadilly. The wall was so unfashionable, so plain, so deliberately turned against the street, that London nicknamed it the Cavendish snub. Behind the wall, however, lay one of the finest Palladian villas in England. William Kent had designed the house for the third Duke and finished it about 1740. The great saloon could hold 300 people. The picture gallery held works by Van Dyck, Rembrandt, Rubens, and the Boyle collection inherited from Lord Burlington. The library held one of the great private collections of rare books in Europe. By 1777, Georgiana had turned Devonshire House into the unofficial headquarters of the Whig opposition. The leader of the opposition, Charles James Fox, was a regular guest. So was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who was writing The School for Scandal that year, and using Georgiana's circle as quiet research. So was Edmund Burke. So, most dangerously, was the Prince of Wales, who had begun to use Devonshire House as a refuge from his father, George III. The prince was 19, charming, dissolute, and politically dangerous. He flirted with Georgiana in the open. The newspapers noticed. The Duke noticed. The Duke said nothing. By her 20th birthday, Georgiana was the Empress of fashion. By her 21st, she was the social hostess of half a parliament. Marie Antoinette in Paris and Georgiana in London corresponded, exchanged sketches of dresses, and treated each other as the two great public mirrors of the age. The two women would never meet in person. They were each, in their own country, building the same trap. Chapter 4. The other woman, who stayed in the summer of 1782, Georgiana met a stranger in Bath who would not leave her side for 24 years. The stranger was Lady Elizabeth Hervey Foster, called Bess. She was 23 years old, the daughter of the 4th Earl of Bristol, separated from a violent and drunken husband named John Foster, and entirely without money of her own. She had 2 small sons by Foster, who had been taken from her under the laws of the day, in which a wife's children belonged to her husband even when he beat her. She was small, dark, soft-voiced, and astonishingly persistent. Her letters of that summer, several of which survive, describe her circumstances in terms designed to be impossible to refuse. She had nowhere to live. She was reduced to lodgings she could not pay for. She was, she wrote, prepared to do anything for a friend. Georgiana met her at Bath in the company of the Duke. The Duke was taking the waters for one of the small ailments that fashionable men were always taking the waters for. Georgiana, 25 years old and 3 years married, was looking for company. Bess attached herself to them immediately. Within 2 weeks, she had moved into the rooms next to theirs at Bath. Within 6 weeks, she was travelling back to Chatsworth with them as their guest. Within 6 months, she was living at Devonshire House. The arrangement that grew up over the next year was unique, even by the standards of the Devonshire House Set. Bess was Georgiana's closest female friend. She was also, by 1783, the 5th Duke's mistress. The 3 of them shared bedrooms in foreign hotels. They travelled as a triangle. They wrote to each other in the same letters. Georgiana referred to Bess in her diary as her sister. The Duke referred to Bess in his letters as "my dear Bess." Bess referred to herself, in private, as the 3rd Duchess. Modern readers can be forgiven for not believing this arrangement was sustainable. It was. It lasted for 24 years. The reasons are buried in the personalities of the 3 people involved. The Duke wanted female company that did not demand emotional intelligence from him. Bess gave him exactly that. Georgiana wanted a confidant who would not leave her, who knew the worst of her, and who could not turn away. Bess was the perfect candidate because Bess had nowhere else to go. Bess wanted security, respectability, and a roof over her head. She got all 3, and over the years, she got a great deal more. By the spring of 1785, Bess was pregnant by the Duke. The pregnancy was a problem the family knew how to solve. Bess was sent quietly abroad, to a village outside Naples, with a trusted maid and a trusted physician. The story given to the staff at Devonshire House was that Bess had gone to take the Italian air for her health. The baby, a girl, was born in August of 1785 and named Caroline Rosalie Adelaide St. Jules. She was placed at first in the care of a French wet nurse and later brought back to England as a foundling, the daughter of friends in difficulty. She grew up at Devonshire House. So far as any servant or visitor could see, she was a child of mysterious origin who had been taken in out of Christian kindness. 3 years later, in 1788, the same procedure was repeated. This time Bess was sent to Vaucluse in southern France. The child, a boy, was named Augustus William James Clifford. He too came back to Devonshire House as a foundling. He would later be created a baronet and serve in the Royal Navy. He would learn the truth of his birth only when he was an adult, and he would never speak of it publicly. While Bess was bearing the Duke's children abroad, Georgiana was bearing his children at home. Her first surviving child, Lady Georgiana Dorothy Cavendish, called Little G, was born on the 12th of July, 1783. Her second, Lady Harriet Elizabeth Cavendish, called Harry O, was born on the 29th of August, 1785, only weeks after Bess gave birth to Caroline in Italy. The longed-for male heir, William George Spencer Cavendish, called Hart, was born on the 21st of May, 1790. The dukedom now had its successor. The marriage had performed its primary function. The household at Devonshire House by the early 1790s contained, under one roof, the 3 legitimate Cavendish children, the 2 illegitimate foster children, and the small daughter, Charlotte Williams, whom the Duke had fathered before his marriage on the milliner Charlotte Spencer. 6 children, 3 mothers, 1 father, 1 nominal duchess, 1 shadow duchess, and 1 absent and respectfully forgotten predecessor. The children were not told the truth. They were brought up to refer to one another by simple first names. They were never to ask whose child was whose. Georgiana loved Bess. The letters make this unambiguous. She also knew, in some part of her, what was being done to her. Her private writing in the late 1780s is full of small, dark moments in which the public smile gives way. She had become, before she was 30, the chief decorative attraction of a household in which her husband slept with her best friend and raised her best friend's children alongside her own, as if all 5 were one family. She could not change it without losing everything. She did not try. The arrangement contained inside it the seeds of its own undoing. Bess, by the late 1780s, had a stronger grip on the Duke's emotional life than Georgiana ever had. The Duke, in turn, tolerated Georgiana's reckless behaviour, in part because Bess made it easy for him to do so. Bess was a buffer. She listened to Georgiana cry. She listened to the Duke complain. She carried messages. She covered for both of them. She was indispensable. She was also, very quietly, taking the long view. After Georgiana's death in 1806, Bess would marry the Duke. She would become the 5th Duchess of Devonshire in her own right. She would inherit Devonshire House for the duration of her widowhood. She would die in Rome in 1824, with most of her secrets intact. But before any of that, the arrangement had to survive one more catastrophe. By 1790, while Bess was abroad with the Duke's 2nd illegitimate child, and Georgiana was nursing the heir to the dukedom, a different shadow was already moving into the household. His name was Charles Grey, and he was about to take from Georgiana the only thing she had left to lose. Chapter 5. The debts she whispered into her pillow. By the spring of 1783, Georgiana already owed sums her husband would have called impossible. The gambling began, as most aristocratic gambling began in the 1770s, in the great public rooms of London. The fashionable game was faro, a card game of pure chance in which a banker held the deck and the players bet on which cards would fall. The pace was fast. The stakes were anything the players agreed. The house always made its money in the long run. The players were entirely free to ruin themselves in the short run. Georgiana fell into it in the first year of her marriage. The pattern was set early. She lost more than she could pay. She wrote a note for the loss. The note was held by the winner or by a discreet banker. The note came due. She borrowed to settle it. The borrowing carried interest. She gambled again to try to recover the borrowed sum. She lost again. The debt grew. By 1777, 3 years into the marriage, she owed £3,000 in private notes she had not told anyone about. By 1779, the figure had grown to 10,000. By 1783, it had grown to 30,000. By 1784, her admitted losses were £100,000. The true figure was almost certainly higher. The numbers need to be felt. £100,000 in 1784 was not a sum a private person could imagine. It was, by the cheapest comparison through retail prices, the modern equivalent of about £15 million. It was, by the comparison of average earnings, closer to £150 million. It was several times the annual income of the entire Devonshire estate. It was greater than the sale price, decades later, of the entire town of Buxton. It was 3 times the assessed value of Devonshire House and its 3 acres of garden. It was the sort of figure for which a private individual in the 18th century could be transported, imprisoned for life, or simply hounded into suicide. She told nobody, not the Duke, not her mother, not Bess, not her sister Harriet. The notes piled up, the interest compounded. The banker, Thomas Coutts, who would later be the most discreet private banker in London, lent her money against future expectations. The dressmakers carried her on credit for years. The foreign ambassadors, particularly the French and the Russian, offered her small lines of credit in the hope of small political favours in return. The Prince of Wales, who was even worse with money than she was, lent her sums he himself had borrowed. She borrowed from her brother George, Lord Spencer, who could afford it and who could be relied upon not to tell their mother. She borrowed, one humiliating afternoon, from her own coachman, who had savings. The mechanism of concealment was complicated. She kept 2 sets of accounts. She wrote to creditors in code names. She paid the most pressing notes by taking out new notes with other creditors. She used Devonshire House as collateral on paper that the Duke never saw. She begged friends to delay presenting their bills. She wrote, in one surviving letter from 1787, that she could not sleep at night for thinking of the totals. The Duke, when he eventually realised that she was in difficulty, paid off what she would tell him about. He paid off a debt of about £6,000 in 1787 and considered the matter closed. He did not ask the obvious next question. She did not volunteer the obvious next answer. She had been trained by her mother, by her marriage, and by her own temperament to keep public face at any private cost. She would keep it for another 19 years. In the surviving letters to her mother in the late 1780s, she sometimes broke. She wrote, in one famous letter, that she felt herself becoming a slave to the table. She wrote, in another, that she would gladly leave society forever if she could be allowed to take her children and live quietly in the country. She would write these letters at 4 in the morning, seal them, and never send them. Several were found in her papers after her death. The gambling was not only about money, it was about the only space in her life where she had absolute authority over her own choices. The Duke had not chosen her. Her mother had. The Duke had not loved her. Bess had taken him. Her clothes were dictated by fashion. Her movements were dictated by protocol. Her words were watched by the press. At the faro table, alone, she made her own decisions. The decisions were almost all bad. They were hers. That was, in some private corner of her, what mattered. In 1790, the year her son Hart was born, the debts touched what historians believe was about £90,000. The Duke, exhausted by intermittent revelations, set up a private trust to pay her bills directly without consulting her. The trust did not solve the problem. She continued to gamble. She continued to lose. She continued to take new notes. The trust simply absorbed the older debts and pushed the running total back into shadow. By the time of her death, 16 years later, the cumulative figure, including interest and unpaid notes the Duke had not yet seen, was somewhere in the region of £150,000. He would settle the last of it in 1811, only weeks before his own death. The shadow of the gambling fell on her children. Hart, her son, would later write in his own private memoir that he had been paying off his mother's creditors well into the 1830s, more than 30 years after her death. Her daughters, both married into other great Whig families, were quietly told by their husbands not to play Pharaoh in public. The Devonshire House Set, when she was gone, would remember her for the dresses and the elections and the political wit. The bankers would remember her for the notes. By 1793, the Duke had built a wall around her. He had paid for one round of debts. He had agreed not to ask about the next. He had quietly set the household up to absorb the difference. He believed at this point that the problem was contained. He did not know that the problem was never contained, that it had only learned to hide better. He also did not know that the woman whose debts he had just paid was about to walk into the Westminster Election of 1784 and turn her own face into the most contested political image in Britain. Chapter 6. When she kissed the butchers of Westminster. In April of 1784, she did the unthinkable. She stepped out of Devonshire House and walked into a working-class election. The Westminster election of April and May 1784 was unlike any election that had ever been held in Britain. The constituency of Westminster, which covered most of the central districts of London north of the Thames, was the largest urban electorate in the country. Roughly 12,000 men could vote. Many of them were tradesmen, shopkeepers, publicans, butchers, candle makers, tailors, and carriage drivers. The franchise was not based on property in the same restrictive way as in the rural counties. A man who paid rates in a small workshop in Soho had as much vote as a man in a townhouse in Mayfair. This was, in 18th century terms, near universal urban male suffrage. The election mattered. The Whig opposition, led by Charles James Fox, was fighting for its political life. The young Prime Minister William Pitt, supported by King George III, had taken power in the previous December. Fox had been driven out of office. He had returned to Parliament for his old Westminster seat, which he had held for several years. If he lost it, his entire political position collapsed. The court, the king, and the Pitt government were determined that he should lose. The Tory candidate was Sir Cecil Ray. The contest was expected to be vicious. Fox went into the election with one great asset, the loyalty of the Devonshire House Set. Georgiana made the decision quickly. She would canvass for him. She would not write letters from a drawing room. She would walk the streets. She would knock on doors. She would speak to men whose vote she wanted. Her sister Harriet, Lady Duncannon, would come with her. The Duchess of Portland would come. Mrs. Mary Robinson, the actress, would come. Anne Seymour Damer, the sculptor, would come. The Whig ladies, all dressed in the buff and blue colours of Fox's campaign, with foxtails pinned to their hats, would go into Covent Garden and the meat markets and the bootmakers' shops, and they would ask, politely and personally, for the vote. The canvass began on the 8th of April. By the 11th of April, Georgiana was the talk of every coffee-house in London. Crowds followed her carriage. Newspapers reported each address she visited. The Pittite press, which had begun the election expecting a quiet victory, found itself confronted with something genuinely new. The most famous, most photographed, most fashionable woman in England was walking into pork butchers' shops in Covent Garden and asking for their votes. The Tory press response was savage and personal. The caricaturists were unleashed. James Gilray, James Sayers, Thomas Rowlandson, and a dozen lesser engravers produced print after print in which Georgiana was shown lifting her skirts to the butchers, exchanging kisses for promises, climbing onto the laps of strangers. One famous print showed her embracing a man in a leather apron with the caption, "The Devonshire, or most approved method of securing votes." Another showed Fox himself perched on her shoulder while she handed coins to a tradesman. A third, more obscene than the rest, suggested in barely coded language that she had become a public prostitute on Fox's behalf. The pamphlets repeated the imagery in cheaper form. Within 2 weeks, the phrase "the butcher-kissing Duchess" was current across London. Within 3 weeks, it had reached Edinburgh and Bristol. Within 4 weeks, her own husband was hearing it shouted at him from the gallery of the House of Lords. The Duke, who had said nothing about Bess, said nothing about Georgiana's gambling, and said almost nothing about her dress, asked her in private to stop. She did not stop. She kept canvassing. She paid for ribbons. She paid for printed cards. She paid, in some cases that were never properly accounted for the dinners of voters who promised support. She visited Fox at his lodgings to report. She went, on at least 2 separate occasions, into public houses that no respectable woman had entered. She was photographed in her mind by the entire population of London. She was burned in effigy by Pittite mobs in Islington and Holborn. She was cheered in the streets of Covent Garden. She was, for the only sustained moment of her adult life, in the centre of national politics. The voting took 6 weeks under the system of the time, in which the polling booths in Covent Garden stood open day after day and votes were taken in batches. The results came in slowly. Lord Hood took 6,694 votes. Charles James Fox took 6,234. Sir Cecil Ray took 5,998. 2 members for Westminster were returned. Hood and Fox were the winners. Fox had kept his seat by a margin of 236 votes. The Whigs claimed it as a famous victory. The Tories claimed it as a moral defeat. Georgiana sat at Devonshire House when the result was confirmed and is said to have wept with relief. The political price was real. Fox would never govern again in Pitt's lifetime. The Whigs were out of office for more than 20 years. The Reform Act that Charles Grey, Georgiana's future lover, would eventually carry into law in 1832 was still half a century away. The Westminster Election did not turn the tide. The personal price was greater. Georgiana never canvassed in person again. The image of the butcher kissing Duchess was burned into the visual memory of the British public. 20 years later, in the early 1800s, Tory newspapers would still print versions of the same caricatures whenever Whig women appeared in political settings. 50 years later, in the 1830s, the prints would still be sold in cheap shops in Cheapside. The first English woman to take political campaigning into the street had been turned, in the public eye, into a woman who sold her body for votes. She had learned something important and would never forget it. Her image, the thing she had so carefully built since the age of 17, was no longer hers. It belonged to the engravers. It belonged to the press. It belonged to the men who hated her husband's politics. It would never belong fully to her again. She walked back through the blank wall of Devonshire House at the end of May 1784 and stayed inside it for the rest of that summer. She would emerge again. She would never be quite the same person. Chapter 7. The Lover Who Made Her Disappear. She was 32 when she fell in love with a younger man who had no fortune and no patience. His name was Charles Grey. He had been born on the 13th of March 1764 at Falladon in Northumberland, the son of a country baronet who had taken his title for service in the 7 Years' War. He had been educated at Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge. He had entered the House of Commons for the borough of Northumberland in 1786, 2 months before his 22nd birthday. He was tall, narrow-faced, dark-haired, and clever. He spoke without notes. He believed in parliamentary reform. He believed in Catholic emancipation. He believed in the abolition of the slave trade. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a young man on the make, that the world should rearrange itself around his programme. By 1788, he was at Devonshire House. Georgiana saw him first across a crowded room and noticed nothing in particular. The two of them grew closer slowly across 1788 and 1789. They walked in the gardens at Chiswick. They sat at the same dinners. They argued about France. Georgiana, who had always treated younger men with the bright, easy flirtation of an experienced hostess, found that this one returned the flirtation seriously. By the spring of 1790, they were lovers in the precise sense of the word. She had been unfaithful to the Duke before, in the discreet aristocratic manner of her circle. Brief liaisons, often hardly more than weekends, with men of her own age and class who knew the rules. The rules said discretion. The rules said no children. The rules said no public love. The Duke tolerated such affairs because all his peers tolerated them. He himself had Bess. He himself had Charlotte Spencer before that. He himself, on at least 3 occasions, had taken visiting opera singers to bed. The aristocratic marriage of the late 18th century, in its highest form, was an alliance of dynastic management and not a contract of fidelity. What Georgiana now did, however, broke every rule of that alliance. She did not just sleep with Charles Grey. She believed she loved him. He, in his early 20s, certainly believed he loved her. She began to imagine a future in which she might leave the Duke. She wrote to Grey letters that her mother, finding them later, would describe as full of madness. She began to talk about Italy. She began to talk about a divorce her class did not grant. In the autumn of 1791, she discovered that she was pregnant. She was 34. The child could not possibly be the Duke's. She had not slept with the Duke in over a year. He knew it. The household knew it. Bess knew it. The Duke moved with cold precision. He did not lose his temper. He did not strike her. He did not raise his voice. He summoned her into his private apartment at Devonshire House one afternoon in October and laid out the terms. She would go abroad. She would go that month. She would take her sister Harriet and her sister-in-law Lady Bessborough as travelling companions. She would not see Charles Grey again. She would have the child wherever she could, in privacy, and the child would not be hers to keep. The child would be given to Grey's family. The Duke would not divorce her, because divorce would damage the family. He would, however, never permit her to see her own 3 legitimate children again, unless she agreed to all of these terms. She agreed. There was nothing else to agree to. To refuse meant to be cast out into a public scandal that would have made her unable to live anywhere in Europe. To accept meant that she could, in time, come home. She left England in late October 1791. The party travelled by carriage to Dover, took the packet to Calais, and moved south through revolutionary France. The journey was strange and terrifying. France in 1791 was no longer the country Georgiana had known. The King and Queen were under partial house arrest at the Tuileries. The provincial towns were ruled by revolutionary committees. The roads were full of armed citizens. Georgiana's carriage was stopped at every barrier. She was, more than once, made to show her papers and explain her business. She wrote in her diary that she could feel the country shaking under the wheels of her coach. The party reached Aix-en-Provence in the south of France in late January 1792. They took rooms in a quiet house. They explained their presence with the standard cover story of women travelling for health. The pregnancy, which had been concealable under a heavy travelling cloak, could no longer be hidden. Georgiana, who had given birth 3 times before in great houses with attentive physicians, gave birth this time in a borrowed bed in a strange town with a French midwife who did not know her name. The labour began on the 19th of February. The baby, a healthy girl, was born at some hour on the 20th of February 1792. Georgiana held the child for an evening. The arrangements had already been made. The wet nurse arrived the following day. The baby was named Eliza Courtney, in mock of a cover story that involved a Courtney family that did not exist. The Duke's instructions were waiting in a sealed letter. The child was to be sent, as soon as she was strong enough to travel, to Charles Grey's parents at Falloden in Northumberland. Eliza was taken from her mother in stages. First to a nurse, then, several weeks later, to Lyon, then, in the late spring, north and west, to a friend of the Grey family. Then, in early summer, by sea from Bordeaux back to England, and from there north to Northumberland. By the time the child reached Falodin, she was 4 months old. She would grow up there as the niece, ward, and supposed daughter of the elderly Sir Charles and Lady Grey. She would call them mother and father. She would not learn until adulthood that the woman she had occasionally been allowed to meet at distant family gatherings, the famous Duchess of Devonshire, was her real mother. She would learn it from her brother Charles, the future Prime Minister, in a private letter. She would tell no one. She would die in 1859, having kept the secret all her life. Georgiana left Aix-en-Provence in the early summer of 1792. She would not return to England for almost 2 more years. The Duke wanted her absence long enough that London would forget. He wanted no return until any whisper of the pregnancy had died. She would not see her own legitimate children for the entire period. Little G was 9. Harry-O was 7. Hart was 2. They were being raised by Bess, by the Duke, and by the servants. When Georgiana finally walked back through the blank wall of Devonshire House in September 1793, her 2-year-old son did not recognise her. Chapter 8. The Daughter. She was not allowed to know. Eliza Courtenay was born on the 20th of February 1792 and taken from her mother before her name could be set down. The story of Eliza Courtenay's first weeks of life sits at the centre of Georgiana's tragedy. The events themselves are easy to describe. The emotional weight is harder to estimate even now. A 34-year-old woman, in a borrowed room in a foreign town, gave birth to a healthy daughter. The daughter was taken from her. The mother, broken inside in a way she could not afford to show, did her makeup, packed her bags, and continued the next stage of her exile. She wrote in her travel diary, in the first week of March 1792, that her hands shook so badly when she signed her name that the ink ran. The party left Aix and moved north and east. They crossed into Switzerland in May. They settled for a time in Lausanne, where they took rooms in a small villa overlooking the lake. The Duke's instructions were that Georgiana should be visible enough in respectable European company to suggest that she was abroad for ordinary aristocratic reasons, but quiet enough to attract no London newspaper. Lausanne in 1792 was full of English exiles. Edward Gibbon, the historian, lived nearby. The Duke and Duchess of Polignac, fleeing the French Revolution, were there. The novelist, Madame de Staël, was in and out of the town. Georgiana attended dinners. She wrote letters home in which she sounded almost cheerful. The cheerfulness was, by every reading, performed. In the same months, France slid into open terror. The September massacres in Paris in September 1792 killed more than 1,000 prisoners in 5 days. The King Louis XVI was put on trial in December. He was executed on the 21st of January 1793. Marie Antoinette, Georgiana's pen friend and dress correspondent for nearly 20 years, was held in the Temple prison through the summer and then in the Conciergerie. On the 16th of October 1793, the former Queen of France was beheaded in the Place de la Révolution before a crowd of thousands. Georgiana, who had received Marie Antoinette's last surviving letters less than 3 years earlier, read of the execution in a Swiss newspaper. She wrote afterwards that she had not been able to speak for an entire day. The fear in Georgiana's class in these months is hard to overstate. The French aristocracy, in which she had had cousins, friends, dressmakers and correspondents, was being murdered. Country houses across France were being burned. The Cavendish estates in England were politically secure. Their owners were not. The party at Lausanne began to speak of returning home. The Duke wrote that they were not to return yet. The London newspapers had stopped speculating about Georgiana's whereabouts only a few months earlier. He wanted another year. They moved south again, into Italy. They wintered at Pisa. They moved on to Naples. They were received politely by exiled royalty and by curious British travellers. Georgiana wrote letters about volcanoes and ancient ruins. She wrote no letters at all about Eliza. There are no surviving references to the child in her correspondence of 1792 and 1793. Whether she destroyed such letters herself or never wrote them, no one knows. In England, meanwhile, Eliza was settling into Falodon. Sir Charles and Lady Grey, in their late 60s, took the baby into the nursery rooms of the country house. They told their servants that the child was the orphaned daughter of distant cousins. They wrote regularly to the Duke at Devonshire House to report her health. The Duke passed the letters on, opened, to Georgiana in Italy. Georgiana read them, sitting at hotel desks and writing tables across the south of Europe. The handwriting in the letters was usually Lady Grey's. The descriptions were of small things. The child was healthy. The child was beginning to smile. The child had taken her first solid food. The child had said her first word. Georgiana read the letters and answered with formal thanks. She could not afford to put more into the answers. She knew the Duke read every line. By the late summer of 1793, the Duke decided that his wife might come home. The London papers had moved on to other scandals. The French Revolution had given the public larger horrors to think about. There would be no easy return, but there could be a quiet one. He summoned her back through a series of letters in August and September. She left Italy in September. She crossed the Alps. She moved north through what was left of polite Europe. She crossed the Channel in early October. She arrived at Devonshire House in the second week of October 1793. Her 2-year-old son, Hart, the future 6th Duke, did not know her. He had been less than a year old when she left. He had been raised in her absence by Bess. He clung to Bess when his mother tried to pick him up. Bess, characteristically, smiled and stepped back. Little G and Harry-O, 10 and 8, recognised their mother, but had spent 2 years building a routine without her. The reunion was awkward, quiet, and conducted in front of an audience of servants. The Duke received her in his library, alone, for 10 minutes. The conversation was brief. The terms of her return were clear. She was never again to mention Charles Grey. She was never to attempt to contact Eliza. She would resume her social duties at Devonshire House. She would resume her hostess role for the Whig opposition. She would not gamble at any London table to a degree that would force a public revelation. She would, in everything that London could see, behave as though the previous 2 years had been a continental health tour. She did all of this. The performance, watched from the inside by anyone who knew her well, was visibly costing her something. From the outside, it looked seamless. She would see Eliza only on a handful of occasions over the next 12 years, at distant family gatherings staged so that no one could quite say who was looking at whom. She would never embrace her in public. She would never use her name in a letter the Duke might read. She would die in 1806 without ever telling her own daughter that she was her mother. Eliza would learn the truth from Charles Grey, then Earl Grey and Prime Minister, in a private letter in the 1830s. She would never speak of it. The lost daughter of Aix-en-Provence would be the great silence in the centre of Georgiana's surviving correspondence. It is the silence that defines her. Chapter 9. The Eye That Closed. In the summer of 1796, her right eye began to weep and then to swell. The illness arrived without warning. Georgiana was 39. She was, by the standards of her time, still a young woman. She had no history of eye trouble. The first symptoms in June 1796 were mild, a slight tenderness. a small redness in the corner of the right eye. A feeling, she wrote in a letter to her mother, as though she had been crying for a long time without remembering it. She had her maid bathe the eye with warm water. The symptoms grew worse over a week. By the second week of July, the eye was visibly swollen. The skin around it had begun to flush a deep purple. Movement of the eye was painful. By the end of July, the lid had thickened so much that she could no longer fully open or close it. The physicians of the period had no antibiotics, no anti-inflammatories, no diagnostic equipment beyond their own eyes, no anesthetics worth the name. They had instead a small and unchanging set of treatments. They applied leeches to draw down the inflammation. They cupped the temples to draw blood. They blistered the skin behind the ears in the belief that local irritation could pull the disease outward. They bled the patient generally. None of these treatments did anything except weaken her further. The infection, which modern medicine would probably describe as orbital cellulitis, caused by an underlying tumour or a tooth root abscess, spread. The right eye, by the middle of August, had swollen to the size of a clenched fist, projecting from her face. The pain was constant and severe. She did not sleep. She could not lie down. She sat upright in her chair, hour after hour, day after day. She wrote to her mother in the careful handwriting of someone holding her hand steady with great difficulty. She wrote that she felt the eye burning inside her head. On the 14th of August, the cornea ulcerated and the eye ruptured. The pressure suddenly fell. The pain temporarily reduced. The eye, however, was finished. Vision in it was gone. The lid had been so distended that it would never again close fully. The skin around the orbit, scarred by weeks of inflammation and by blistering treatments, would never fully recover. Georgiana was left with a partially sightless eye, a drooping lid, and a face that no longer matched on its two sides. The recovery, such as it was, took most of a year. She remained at Chatsworth for the autumn of 1796, refusing visitors, sitting in darkened rooms because light still pained the surviving good eye. By the spring of 1797, she was strong enough to travel. She went to Bath to take the waters. She wore a veil. She did not appear in society in any setting where she would be looked at directly. The portraits painted of her in the late 1790s and early 1800s, including the John Hopner of 1798, were carefully composed from her left side, with shadow falling across the right side of her face. The vanity that her enemies had mocked for 20 years now turned against her. The woman who had introduced the ostrich feather, the woman who had made the 4-feet-tall poof into a national fashion, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 caricatures, now had a face that the caricaturists drew with a different cruelty. The Tory press could not resist. A small handful of prints from the late 1790s show her in profile with a black patch over the destroyed eye. The captions are not worth quoting. She must have seen them. She did not respond. The strange truth was that the loss of the eye seems to have changed her less, in private, than the public would have predicted. The letters of the late 1790s are still full of wit, of political comment, of plans for parties, of the running affection between herself and Bess and Harriet. She continued to play hostess at Devonshire House when she could bring herself to be seen. She continued to write to her son, Hart, at Harrow, where he was at school. She continued, with a kind of stubbornness that her friends found heartbreaking, to insist on living. She had decided long before, somewhere inside her early 20s, that her face was both her weapon and her cage. Losing half of it freed her, in a way, from the cage. She did not say this out loud. The letters show it. Her health, however, was now permanently broken. She suffered from chronic headaches, almost certainly from the underlying tumour or infection that had probably caused the eye disease in the first place. She suffered from skin eruptions and from periods of high fever. She was treated for jaundice on more than one occasion in the early 1800s. She lost weight. She was thin and worn-looking. Her old friends, returning from continental tours, recorded their shock at her appearance. In private, she remained the same person she had always been. She was still, in late January 1798, writing satirical verse about the Pittite government. She was still, in the autumn of 1801, organising a small theatrical at Chatsworth, in which Bess played a comic widow, and the Duke laughed for the first time in years. She was still, in the spring of 1804, lending money to political friends she could not really afford to lend it to. She was, in every way that mattered to her, still Georgiana. In the autumn of 1805, she began to feel a new and different pain in her side. Her physicians, baffled as ever, treated her for digestive complaints, then for liver problems, then for jaundice. The skin began to take on the yellow tint of bile in the bloodstream. She continued to entertain. She continued to write letters. On the evening of the 27th of March, 1806, she went to bed at Devonshire House complaining of a fever. She did not get up again. Modern medical historians, looking back at the surviving descriptions, are confident that the illness was a liver abscess, undiagnosed and untreatable in the medicine of the day. The infection spread into the bloodstream. The body shut down. At 20 minutes past 3 in the morning of the 30th of March, 1806, Georgiana stopped breathing. She was 48 years old. In the silence that followed, the Duke walked into her dressing room, opened the drawer of her writing desk, and pulled out the papers he had not been allowed to see for 22 years. Chapter 10. The papers he read after she was gone. At 20 minutes past 3 on the morning of the 30th of March, 1806, she stopped breathing. The Duke was beside her bed. Bess was beside her bed. Lady Bessborough, her sister Harriet, was in the next room. Her son, Hart, 15 years old and home from Harrow for the Easter vacation, had been kept downstairs through the night. He was brought up to see his mother shortly after she died. He stood in the doorway for less than a minute, then turned away. He would write in his private diary, decades later, that he never went into the room again. Within 48 hours, the news was on the front pages. Every London newspaper carried obituaries. The Whig press eulogized her as the Empress of fashion, the friend of liberty, the woman who had brought light into Devonshire House. The Tory press, more grudgingly, acknowledged her wit, her charm, and her early influence on London society. The caricaturists, surprisingly, fell silent for a few weeks. Even the print sellers in Cheapside, who had been mocking her since 1784, took a brief holiday from her image. The funeral was held at All Saints' Church in Derby, where the Cavendishes had buried their dead since the 17th century. The Duke did not attend. He sent his son. He could not, by all accounts, bring himself to walk behind her coffin. He had not loved her in the way she had needed to be loved, and he knew it, and her death seems to have brought him face to face with the knowledge in a way that he could not bear. He stayed at Devonshire House. He drank. He went into her dressing room on the second day with one of the household clerks, and they began to look through her papers. What they found across the next 2 weeks was the true scale of the gambling debts. The Duke, who had paid off many of her debts more than once, who had set up a private trust to manage what he believed were the remainder of her bills, had assumed that the running total was something in the region of £50,000 or £60,000. He discovered notes, IOUs, sealed agreements with foreign embassies, private loans from her dressmakers, advances against her jewellery, and outstanding debts to 7 different London bankers. The cumulative figure, once it was reconstructed by the clerks across the spring and summer of 1806, was somewhere in the region of £150,000. By retail price comparison, this was the modern equivalent of about £22 million. By relative earnings, it was several times that. The Duke paid. He paid quietly. He paid over 5 years. He sold 3 secondary properties, mostly small holdings inherited through his mother's family. He liquidated certain investments. He did not sell Chatsworth. He did not sell Devonshire House. He did not touch the Cavendish library, the picture collection, or the great state apartments. He did, however, draw down the family's cash reserves to a point his ancestors had not known in 100 years. The debt was retired by the end of 1811, only weeks before his own death. In the same period, he also reorganized the household. Bess, who had nursed Georgiana at the end, who had wept openly at her funeral, who had then stayed at Devonshire House to comfort the Duke, was now in a position whose ambiguity was suddenly unsustainable. The Duke decided. On the 19th of October, 1809, 3 years and 7 months after Georgiana's death, he married Bess at a private ceremony in his library at Devonshire House. The witnesses were 2 of his trusted secretaries. There were no flowers. The bride wore black. Lady Elizabeth Hervey Foster Cavendish became, by the simplest act of arithmetic, the 5th Duchess of Devonshire in her own right. She inherited the role her best friend had vacated. She held it for less than 2 years. The Duke, by then, was 62. He had outlived most of his ambitions. His political party had been out of office for a generation. His personal life had narrowed to a small group of survivors. He played cards. He kept his dogs. He took long walks in the gardens at Chiswick. He died of a stroke on the 29th of July, 1811, at Devonshire House, with Bess beside him. He was succeeded by Hart, the longed-for male heir of 1790, now 21 years old. The new Duke would never marry. The reasons sit in the private memoir he wrote in late life, in the strange overlapping shadows of his childhood, in the mother who could not always be present, in the second mother who was something else, in the father who had not loved either of them in the way they needed. Bess outlived the Duke by 13 years. She moved first to a small London house, then to Italy, then permanently to Rome. She used her Cavendish settlement to live well. She corresponded with her surviving children. She died in Rome in March 1824 and was buried there. Her papers, including a remarkable cache of her own letters to and from Georgiana over 25 years, were preserved by her family and are now held in the Chatsworth archives, where any researcher may read them. Eliza Courtenay, the daughter taken at birth, was 32 years old when the 5th Duke died. She was living in Northumberland, the wife of a Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ellis, whom she had married at Scarborough on the 10th of December 1814. She had 4 children of her own. She had never met her mother's other children, her own half-siblings, in any meaningful sense. She would learn the truth of her parentage, almost certainly, from her brother Charles Grey, who became Earl Grey on the death of his father in 1807 and would lead the government that passed the Great Reform Act of 1832. He gave his name to a kind of tea that is still sold today. He never publicly acknowledged Eliza as his half-sister, but he provided for her quietly throughout her life. She died on the 2nd of May, 1859, at the age of 67, in apparent peace. Chapter 11. The Houses that Could Not Hold Forever. The system that built Chatsworth could survive almost anything, except a taxman with a calculator. The Cavendish empire that Georgiana married into in 1774 did not collapse in her lifetime. It did not collapse in her son's lifetime. It did not even collapse in her grandson's lifetime. It collapsed slowly, across about 70 years, under the weight of a single new instrument of government called death duty. The story begins, in this longer sense, with the Finance Act of 1894, passed under the Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Vernon Harcourt. The Act introduced, for the first time in British history, a graduated estate duty payable on the death of the owner. The largest estates, those worth over £1 million, would pay 8%. Smaller estates paid less. The principle was new. The Cavendish lawyers, when they read the Act, understood immediately that the world had changed. The first family head to face the new law in earnest was the 9th Duke, Victor Cavendish, who succeeded his uncle in 1908 and died on the 6th of May, 1938. By the time of his death, estate duty had been raised by Lloyd George's People's Budget of 1909, by the war budgets of 1914 to 1918, and by Snowdon's budgets of the late 1920s. The top rate stood at 50%. The bill on the 9th Duke's estate was over £500,000 in 1938 money, the equivalent of about £35 million today. He had also inherited the debts of the 7th Duke from the 1890s, which the family had been paying off for 40 years. The bill could not be met from rental income alone. The family sold. They sold Devonshire House in Piccadilly in 1920, while the 9th Duke was still alive but already aware of what was coming. The sale price was £750,000. The buyers, a development consortium, demolished the Palladian villa in 1924. The 3 acres of garden, perhaps the most valuable open ground in central London, were built over with a modern office block. The wrought iron gates that William Kent had designed for the 3rd Duke were taken down, dismantled, transported across Piccadilly, and re-erected at the southern entrance of Green Park, where they still stand today. The original wine cellar, dug out of the London clay in the 1730s and lined with brick, survived underground. It became the booking hall of Green Park Underground Station. Anyone who buys an Oyster card at Green Park is standing in the room where the 3rd Duke kept his claret. The family also sold paintings, books, and pieces of land in Sussex, Yorkshire, Derbyshire, and Ireland. They sold William Caxton first editions. They sold Shakespeare quartos. They sold Renaissance bronzes. They sold individual fields. The proceeds brought down the death duty bill across the 1920s and the 1930s. The 10th Duke, Edward Cavendish, inherited in 1938. He was a serious, conscientious man who had married Mary Cecil, the daughter of the Marquess of Salisbury. He raised 3 children. He was politically active. He believed in the survival of the Devonshire estates and worked hard to plan for the next succession. He used the legal mechanism of the deed of gift to transfer Chatsworth to his eldest son, Andrew, during his lifetime. The transfer was made on the 5th of August, 1944, in the late part of the war. Under the tax law of the time, a deed of gift escaped death duty only if the donor lived for at least 5 years after the gift. He did not live 5 years. He died of a heart attack on the 26th of November, 1950, at the age of 55. The gift had been made 6 years and 3 months earlier. The 5-year window had been missed by less than 15 months. The tax authorities ruled that the deed had passed the deadline by such a narrow margin that they would, exceptionally, treat it as valid. The argument that followed lasted years. The Treasury eventually accepted that the Chatsworth gift could not be taxed in full. They imposed instead a lesser settlement combined with full duty on the rest of the estate. The rate of death duty at that time was at the wartime maximum of 80%. The combined bill, even after the Chatsworth concession, was crushing. 9 of the greatest paintings in the Cavendish collection were surrendered to the National Gallery in lieu of cash. Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, the great Elizabethan house built by Bess of Hardwicke in the 1590s, was given to the Treasury and from there transferred to the National Trust. Many rare books were sold at Sotheby's. Substantial agricultural land was sold to neighbouring farmers and to the public. The 11th Duke, Andrew Cavendish, inherited Chatsworth itself, but inherited it broken. He and his wife, Deborah Mitford, spent the next 50 years rebuilding. They opened Chatsworth to the paying public. They built a farm shop, they built tea rooms, they rented out the gardens for weddings. They turned a great private house into a public institution. They restored rooms. They cleaned paintings. They installed lavatories where the painted hall met the state apartments. They survived. The family today still lives at Chatsworth in private apartments, while the public walk through the rooms Georgiana once walked through. The estate is now held in a charitable trust, established in 1981, that will hold it in trust beyond the family. In the same century in which the Cavendish family was forced to sell Devonshire House and surrender Hardwicke Hall, roughly 1,700 British country houses were destroyed. The peak years were the 1950s, in which one major country house in Britain was demolished on average every 5 days. The reasons were the same in almost every case: death duty, inherited debt, falling agricultural rents, the departure of the servant class to better-paid wartime jobs, the collapse of the system of life that the country house had been built to project. Chatsworth survived because the family chose to share it with the public. Devonshire House did not survive. There is a moral in that difference, and it is one Georgiana would have understood from the inside. Chapter 12. The woman the world forgot to remember. She was once the most photographed face in England before photography existed. Reynolds painted her at least 4 times. Gainsborough painted her 3 times, including the great blue-plumed hat portrait that hung in the Royal Academy in 1787 and was stolen from a London dealer in May 1876. The painting was missing for 25 years. The thief, an American criminal named Adam Worth, kept it under his bed for most of 2 decades. It was finally recovered in 1901 and sold to the American banker J.P. Morgan. It returned to Chatsworth, by purchase and by gift, in the 1990s. It hangs today in the State Drawing Room. Visitors walk past it every day. Most do not know who she is. Hoppner painted her in 1798, carefully, from the left side. Maria Cosway painted her in miniature several times. Lawrence painted her shortly before her death. Sketches by lesser hands, caricatures by Gilray and Rowlandson, satirical prints by Sayers, fashion plates by half a dozen French and English engravers, all carried her face into the visual culture of a generation. By the time she died, she had probably been depicted in published images more times than any private woman who had ever lived in Britain. She had built her own visibility, used it as a political instrument, watched it turned against her, lost half of it to disease, and outlived it. She left behind, in addition to her image, an extraordinary archive of words. Thousands of letters survive, held now in the Chatsworth archives, in the British Library, in the John Rylands Library at Manchester, and in private collections. The letters were edited and published in successive editions across the 19th and 20th centuries, most fully and accurately in Amanda Foreman's 1998 biography. The letters show a woman who was funnier than the caricatures, sadder than the portraits, more politically intelligent than her enemies admitted, and more emotionally hungry than her friends understood. They show a person, where the public image has only ever shown a figure. Her 3 legitimate children all lived into the 19th century. Little G, Lady Georgiana Cavendish married the 6th Earl of Carlisle and became Countess of Carlisle. She died in 1858, the same year as her brother Hart. Harriot, Lady Harriet Cavendish, married Lord Granville Leveson Gower, the future Earl Granville, and lived a long and quietly distinguished life as a diplomatic wife in Paris. Hart, the 6th Duke, never married. He spent on the scale his mother had taught him. He built the great conservatory at Chatsworth with Joseph Paxton at a cost of about £33,000. He commissioned the Emperor Fountain, which threw water 290 feet into the air and was the tallest gravity-fed fountain in the world. He paid off the last of his mother's debts in the 1830s. He died in 1858. The dukedom passed to his cousin. Eliza Courtenay, the lost daughter, died in 1859, the year after her 2 half-siblings. Caroline St. Jules, Bess Foster's daughter by the Duke, married a politician named George Lamb and lived in London. Augustus Clifford, Bess Foster's son by the Duke, became a baronet, a naval officer, and Blackrod in the House of Lords. The household of 6 children, 3 mothers, 1 father, that had gathered at Devonshire House in the 1790s, scattered across the 19th century, and most of its members lived ordinary, respectable lives without ever publicly discussing where they came from. The Devonshire House Set, the political and social circle Georgiana had built, did not survive her. The Whig opposition itself splintered, recovered briefly under Charles Grey in the 1830s, then evolved into the Liberal Party of Gladstone and beyond. The Whig style of politics, with its great country house salons, its informal alliances, its political marriages, gave way to the more professional politics of the late 19th century. The blank wall on Piccadilly came down in 1924. The garden became an office. The gates moved to Green Park. The cellar became a tube station. Chatsworth remains. The Painted Hall remains. The state apartments remain. The Gainsborough hat hangs on the wall. The letters sit in the archive. The dresses, in some cases, survive in the Chatsworth collection and have been shown in exhibitions in London, New York, and Paris. The brand of the house, in a strange modern way, has revived. There is a film called The Duchess made in 2008, in which Keira Knightley played Georgiana opposite Ralph Fiennes as the Duke. There are several scholarly biographies. There are novels. There are documentaries. The face that Reynolds and Gainsborough painted is now on calendars, posters, magnets, and tea towels in the Chatsworth gift shop. And yet, in the deeper sense, the world has forgotten her. The story of the great Whig hostess of the 1770s has been replaced by the simpler story of a woman who wore big hats and gambled too much. The political work, the campaign for Fox, the strange triangle with Bess, the lost daughter at Falodon, the eye that ulcerated and burst, the long final illness, the secret debts, all collapse in the popular memory into a kind of sentimental colour wash. The woman herself is harder to see than the dress. What does it cost a person to be looked at by everyone? Georgiana paid in cash, in love, in flesh, in family, in face, and finally in name. She paid in the daughter she could not raise. She paid in the marriage she could not change. She paid in the eye that closed. She paid in the long years of pretending to be the person London needed her to be. She paid more than she could afford. The bill, in the end, was settled by her son, by her husband's executors, by the National Gallery, by the National Trust, by the Treasury, by the developers who took down Devonshire House, by the trust that now holds Chatsworth, and by the millions of visitors who walk past her portrait every year without knowing her name. She wrote, in a letter to her mother in 1797, that she sometimes wondered who would remember her. The answer, 2 centuries later, is that fewer people remember her than ought to, and that even those who do remember her usually remember the wrong things. This video is one small attempt to remember her properly. The empty space on Piccadilly is where her London house used to stand. The gates in Green Park are her gates. The cellar under the tube station is her cellar. And the strawberry blonde girl who walked into Wimbledon Parish Church on her 17th birthday is still, somewhere inside the long shadow of all that wealth, the same person. The world looked at her too hard, for too long, and then it looked away. If she stayed with you in some quiet way, hit subscribe so I can keep telling you the stories the history books left out. And tell me in the comments which moment of Georgiana's life hit hardest for you. The wedding, the Westminster Election, the daughter taken at Aix-en-Provence, the eye that closed, or the empty Piccadilly. I read every reply.